How's everybody doing today? Fabulous. I love that answer. Who took something great away from the breakout sessions? Yeah. Holy cow. I was flitting down between a bunch of them, trying to take notes, trying to keep up, and my goodness, my brain hurts. I was thankful that we had such a big lunch, because my brain is running at full capacity. And so, we've had this fantastic day. We heard from Jay Lair this morning. We had all these breakout options to choose from. We had a great lunch. We had more breakout options. And now we're going to talk markets. Oh, boy. Talk about ending on a low note. But who's been watching the markets the last 2 days? Whoa! I tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, I was freaking out here about lunchtime, watching these markets, watching corn and soybeans push up against some resistance levels. I had to sit up here and redo my presentation. That's a great problem to have. That is a great problem to have. So that's what I'm excited to talk about. We're going to take a look today at what's happening in the short and medium term in the markets. My best guess. I want to share with you guys a couple of the tools that I use and a lot of the analysts I work with use when we're making decisions that relate to marketing. There are some great tools out there. These tools are free. Anybody can use them. And it's all in how you look at things can help drive your trading and your marketing decisions. And the more comfortable we get with our decisions, the less of that seller's remorse we're going to have. We've all sold 5,000 bushel on a nice rally day in the market, only to have the second day be another nice rally day, and we're kicking ourselves. As growers in an industry that's dominated by supply, we need to change that outlook. So I'll talk a little bit about what's happening and how we should change our outlook. And then I want to take a look at the longer term picture. Jay talked this morning about the increasing amount of protein being consumed around the world. That's an issue that is near and dear to my heart. I want to pick that up a little bit, run with a couple of the numbers, and help us think through a little bit. How are we going to quite literally chew through these supplies of corn and soybeans and wheat in the world today? But before we can go too far, we got to take a look at where we're at today. We are still in a period of uncertainty. Over the past 4 years, we have seen net farm income across the country decline by about 44%. On a percentage basis, we have not seen a decline this bad since the Great Depression. And yet, here we are. Agriculture is a resilient industry. Agriculture is an industry that continues to press on, and we adjust to these lower prices. The downside is we're probably not going to see a huge bounce in prices anytime soon. This past Saturday, I had the chance to work with the Iowa State University Beginning Farmers Network. And so it was a group of students. There was about 100 of them, ranging from sophomores in college and probably 2 years out of school, so 23, 24 years old. And I gave a talk very similar to the one I'm going to give today. It's not a very upbeat talk when we're looking at the grain markets. And I had a young man raise his hand afterwards and ask me a question. And I said, yes, you, sir. And he goes, Mike, when are we going to see $7 corn again? I said, great question. Great question. That's something that's on everybody's minds. And the answer is no time soon. Certainly not tomorrow, certainly not in 2018, probably not in 2019, probably not in 2020. The fact is, agriculture is cyclical. And so that got me thinking, and I'm a history major. I went to college, as I mentioned, for 7 years, barely escaped with a degree, and my degree ended up being in history because you can BS your way through a history degree. Not a whole lot of hard science is required when you're studying history. But it has shed some light, and it has influenced the way that I look at the commodity markets in particular. So this is one of my favorite charts. This is something that I've used, and it helps put especially younger producers, put it into perspective exactly what we're looking at in the world of agriculture. What we're looking at here is net corn revenue per acre going back 117 years, 1900 to 2017. We see 4 periods where prices spiked. In each of those 4 periods, there was a fundamental shift in demand. Those first two, 1917 and 1946, folks, what had just ended in those 2 years? War, world wars, yes. If we think about some of the greatest agricultural ground outside the United States, it exists in France. And if we think of World War I, and we think of World War II, we think of the Battle of the Bulge, we think of these places, some of the greatest, not as good as our farm ground, as yours here in the Red River Valley or mine in the state of Iowa, was torn up, was filled with trenches, tank tracks, and unexploded ordnance. Now, I'm no agronomist, but those things aren't fantastic for improving yield. Those are not inputs you want in your field. So what happened was agriculture around the world was in shambles. Global demand poured into the United States, and we saw agriculture demand drove prices to record highs in both those instances. Then we had the 1970s. We opened up the Soviet Union. All of a sudden, this new demand source was millions of starving communists who now could eat thanks to the productive capability of American agriculture. That demand boom kept running for about 6 years until Jimmy Carter ended it with the Soviet grain embargo in 1979. And then we've got the most recent demand boom that occurred. Before we talk about that, I want us to look at those three that have happened previously, and we see what comes after. After each case, we see margins get tighter. If we look at the 1920s, after that first boom in 1918, look at that. That is a catastrophe. Agriculture overproduced, high prices cured high prices, and prices collapsed. We had a crisis that lasted 20 years in the ag industry. It took until World War II for us to pull out of it. 1970s, huge demand boom from the Soviet Union. Jimmy Carter ends it. All of a sudden, that demand is gone. We've been encouraged to produce so much, we've become very efficient at production, and we saw the ag industry collapse in the 1980s. The question that we have to be asking ourselves as we look out to the future is, will this next correction point in agriculture look like the 1920s and the 1980s? Will it be a crisis for American and global agriculture? Or will it look more like the period from the end of World War II to the opening of the Soviet Union? That was a period that saw tighter margins. We did see profitability decline following the immediate post-war era, but we also saw prices remain fairly stable. We had productivity growth across the farmland sector. We had efficiency growth on almost every operation in this country. We had yield improvements. Everybody was using hybrid corn by that time. And yet prices never collapsed. Demand was the story. We get these demand spikes that shock the market and run prices up to record levels. But we also have stable demand sources. And what happened in the 1950s and 60s was that the baby boomer generation was born and coming of age, and their parents wanted to ensure they lived a higher standard of living than what those parents had had living through the Great Depression and the deprivation of World War II, which meant feeding their children a lot more meat, milk, and eggs. We saw an incredible explosion in the livestock herd. We saw a new way of dining take shape in the 1950s. We had fast food. Who here has eaten a meal at a fast food place in the past week? One of you? I'm going to count gas station food. Who's had a Casey's Pizza? The fact is, we changed the way Americans consume food in the 1950s, and that change led to increased consumption for high-quality proteins. And all of those proteins, in order to be produced, required more feed grains. And that was the stable demand that led us into the 1970s. Let's bring it back to where we are today. Let's take a look at what prompted this huge rally. Whoa! And let's take a look at where we can go from here. If we think back to 2005, the start of this commodity super cycle, we had three things come together. We had the Chinese economy begin its transition into manufacturing in the early 1990s, pulling people out of the rural areas, moving them into towns. They're working for a living now. They're working at factories. They're building, widgets and so forth, shipping it back to the U.S. They're buying food at grocery stores, not raising them on their subsistence farm. That's phase one. We begin shipping more beans and bean meal over to China. First leg of the demand stool. Second leg was really created in the depths of the 1980s farm crisis, but it came to fruition in the early 2000s, and that's the ethanol boom. All of a sudden, we had folks from the Middle East on 9/11 attack our country. And our president said, you know what, we are not going to rely on them for our energy source. We need homegrown sources of energy, and we found it in ethanol. And we began the ethanol boom, starting with the RFS in 2005, accelerated with RFS2 in 2007, and we were building ethanol plants like crazy throughout the Corn Belt. That's the second leg. That's corn demand took off. The third leg of the stool is a unique one. And it's unique in the sense that we haven't really seen it before driving prices. The third thing that happened in 2008. We hit the global financial crisis. We live in a world, and we've lived in this world since about 1996, where massive pools of money exist. They exist in Dubai as sovereign wealth funds. They exist in New York City and in London as large hedge funds. And these pools of money move that money. It's very liquid. They move it from industry to industry, index to index, market to market, any place that they believe they can get a return. And in 2008, there were not a lot of places to put those dollars. We had residential real estate fall apart. We had commercial real estate fall apart. We had the equity markets fall apart. We had the bond markets kind of just twiddle on forward. There was nothing that looked good as a place to put money. There was no bull story in the world except for commodity markets, and in particular, the ag commodities. So for 5 years, we had these large-scale speculative investors rushing into the ag world. They were buying farm ground. They were buying ag machinery companies. They were investing heavily, taking long positions on the Chicago Board of Trade. That was the fuel that shot us up on top of those two legs of the demand stool that really created those high prices 2008 through 2013. Now, things have changed. The American farmer continues to get better and better at what we do. We come to meetings like this, we take great practices home, and we put them to work on our farm, and guess what? Yields get better. And we keep growing more and more crops. We come out of the drought of 2012. We see an incredible harvest in 2013, 2014, 2015 was great, 2016 was great, 2017 was, I heard this all throughout the fall. How were yields? Well, Mike, we're pleasantly surprised. Heard that from everybody. When everybody's pleasantly surprised, that means we've got a monster crop, and USDA verified it. That's what happened. So now we've come down off those highs. We've come down off that demand peak of 2005 through 2013. The question for us going forward is what is going to sustain us? Do we go into a crisis like the 20s and 80s? Or, and I'm an optimist, I feed cattle, so I might be an idiot, but I believe that we are going to see enough demand develop, both domestically and around the world, to allow growers to continue to increase our yields and remain profitable. Here's where it gets a little depressing. Could we throw that chart back up there, please? Here's the chart. 117 years, 4 demand spikes. We peaked the last one, 2013. They occur roughly every 30 years. When's the next one going to take place? 25 years from now. Who's here still wants to be farming 25 years from now? 6 of you. Wow. Kind of a downer bunch up here in North Dakota. Who's going to call it a win if you're above ground 25 years from now? All right, and Jay, of course you will be. The decisions we're making here over the next 1 to 24 years have to be about how can we position our operations on a sure enough footing that when those demand spikes come back, because we know they will, we are cyclical, how can we be positioned in such a way that we can make the most of those shifts in demand to really expand our operation? That's what I want us to be thinking about. That's what I want us to be approaching 2018 with, the mindset that, yeah, okay, prices aren't great, we're building demand, and we're going to be able to acquire assets at a price level that allows us to be sustainable long term. But before we can do any of that, we got to talk about where the market is today. And the corn market, hey, we closed right at resistance today. Actually, just a little bit below resistance. We're looking at March corn here on your left, and that is my super fancy resistance line right there. And we're looking at December corn over on the right. We've got a little ways to go before we really start to get close to resistance. The question I get asked a lot is, when should I be selling my grain? That's a great question. It's a fantastic question. And you should begin selling your grain when you're profitable. Well, how do you know if you're profitable? Well, hopefully, you have figured out your cost of production. And a lot of lenders have been really good over the past 5 years. And as Don said, I'm a former banker, and it's former for a reason. I'm much happier borrowing money than I am lending it out. I like being in debt. I like buying crazy crap. My wife doesn't. She's usually not very thrilled with me, but she'll bounce back. We're not divorced yet. So the question is, when we're looking at when should I be selling grain, we need to be utilizing all of the tools that we have. And we've got more spreadsheet and financial tools available to us today than we have ever had before in history. We need to be utilizing them to figure out our cost of production from an 8pH perspective per bushel. We've been doing it per acre, and I think that was a great way to do it. It's better than looking at it at an enterprise level profitability balance sheet. But if we can get it down to a per bushel basis, now all of a sudden we've got an anchor. And we've got a point at which we can begin to scale into sales. That being said, if you don't know your cost of production, I really like rewarding the market when we have nice rallies. We look back over the past 2 weeks, and old crop corn in particular, we have had phenomenal rallies. Now, I know basis has taken a hit right along with that rally, or at least it has in my part of the world. It was almost a penny for penny gain and loss there on the futures versus basis. But at the end of the day, we've come around quite a bit. I want to be rewarding the market with some sales in here in an up market. Not everything. Don't sell every bin you've got out, but let's start scaling into some sales so we can be through this corn crop as we head into the summer months. Because we do know that South America has every incentive to continue to produce corn, even if they are seeing a little expansive drought area at present. On new crop, 2 years ago, we had a planting issue. We had some dryness early in the growing season. We ran that market up to $4.49. Who here was planning on making sales at $4.50? None of you? BS. I was. We all were. Because the market was on a tear. Did we get $4.50? No, we did not. We got to $4.49 and then it collapsed. Last year, market begins to rally. We've got dryness. Ho, things are getting exciting. Weathermen are talking, hey, this could be 2012 again. This is right when it got dry in 2012. Market starts to rally. It runs all the way up to $4.17. Who wanted to sell corn at $4.20? Who didn't? Yes. The fact is, in those 2 years that we have seen these price spikes happen, we have at the same time added to the carryout. So this year, as we look out, should we expect to see corn rally too much over $4.17? My thought is no. We have a much bigger carryout in 2018 than we did in 2017. It's bigger still than it was in 2016. We have ample supplies in this market. We look at that December market, we're at $3.96-ish is where we closed today. I really like that $4 mark. Psychological, but I like it. It's a nice round number. I'll take $3.98. Start getting some sales on the book. Start forward contracting if you're comfortable with it. Start selling on the board. And if you want to re-own, do it with your options. Buy the call and see if it'll appreciate that way. But be ready to unload that call if the market gives you that signal. The corn, things are turning around. This is one of those tools that I think growers need to be utilizing when we're making selling decisions. This is called the Commitment of Traders Report. It comes out every Friday, and it's a breakdown of who is setting the price in our industry. It's published by the CFTC. It reflects the makeup of the trading community of the Tuesday before. So if it comes out on Friday, it'll show activity as of today. I use cotpricecharts.com. I think they do the best job breaking down the Commitment of Traders Report. That's where this chart comes from. They break it down into basically 3 broad categories. We've got large-scale speculators. Those are those blue lines. You see them spike, and then you see them sell. If they're above the line, they're long the market. If they're below, they're short. The red line, commercial traders. These are folks that will touch that physical grain or could touch that physical grain at some point in the marketing process. They're elevators buying from farmers. They're exporters. They're large feedlots. They're anybody with an actual interest in the crop itself. And finally, there's a very faint, very small yellow bar, and that is small-scale speculators. That's if you or I call our broker and say, hey, there's a drought developing, buy me a 1 December corn contract. That's where we'd be counting. I like to use the Commitment of Traders Report because we can see very clearly when those speculative investors are putting the most risk premium into the market. This chart here, we're looking at a year's worth of COT reports. We see two places where outside spec investors are the longest in the market. We've got that first period, which is effectively January 1st through about the third week in March. Why would outside speculative traders be so long the market at that point? We haven't started planting. All of the risk of the growing season is ahead of us. We could have a drought. We could have a very wet spring. The crops might not get in. So there's premium to be added to incentivize you folks to get the corn in the ground. So these outside investors are buying. They want to be first in there. They're running prices up. Prices were over $4 that entire 3-month period. Then we get to March. We get into April. And what happens? Crop goes in. Some places in Indiana got the crop in 3 times this last spring. At the end of the day, it went in the ground. So that initial wave of risk is gone. Those large-scale speculators take their ball and go home. You know, corn rally didn't materialize. There wasn't a drought. Enough corn went in the ground. Let's take our money out of corn and put it into stocks or bonds or whatever. So they sold. So then you can see they're short to flat the market until we get this huge spike. That's the last week in June, first week in July. Things were getting dry. Corn market's starting to rally. We don't know what's coming. We're heading into the 4th of July weekend. If we remember 2012, it was that July 6th crop conditions report that started that 2012 rally. These folks wanted to be in on that. They wanted to be in on the ground floor should corn take off. They rushed into the market. They went from a 5,000 contracts short to 170,000 contracts long at 5,000 bushels a crack. That is a huge amount of buying power. Right there, that second very tall bar in the middle of this chart, that's the second week in July. What did the price of corn hit the second week of July on the December contract? $4.17. Peak of the market. Peak of outside investors. When we're looking at this chart and we're trying to make our decisions on marketing, I want us to keep an eye on those outside investors. And when I'm looking at it, I want to picture in my head a fella from New York City, Wall Street, pinstripe suit, shark type. And he's walking towards me with handfuls of money, and he is trying to give them to me as a holder of corn. Ladies and gentlemen, if somebody from New York City is trying to hand you money, what should you do? What? Take it! Take the money! Yes! That's what we need to be doing, and that's what that Commitment of Traders report can help us make that decision. If they're wanting to give you money, folks, take it. If we can pull that up again real quick, I want to show you something interesting. This past little rally that we've had over 2 weeks, let's look at the position of those outside speculators. Incredibly short our market since harvest. Incredibly short until, 2 weeks ago. They're walking towards us right now. This is an opportunity to make some sales. Could they continue to get long? Absolutely they could. If drought in Argentina continues, if the dollar continues to weaken, yeah, they could continue to buy more contracts and we could continue to see a rally. But right here, a lot of folks, fistful of dollars, coming from New York City to North Dakota, take it. It's one of those great tools that we have available. Check it out every Friday at about 2 p.m. Commitment of Traders report comes out. Next, I want to talk about the soybean market just briefly. Soybeans have a much better picture, fundamentally speaking, than corn does. We did just add to it. The USDA published their latest World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates this last week. They raised the soybean carryout 60 million bushels because exports have been slow. We knew that going into it. We still saw beans rally on the news. So all in all, things are sitting pretty well. We do know that the USDA has underestimated soybean demand for the past 10 years, 12 years. They've been wrong. The market knows it too. The downside is the market also knows at some point USDA is going to get it right. And maybe this is the year. So that's the push and pull that we've got there. The second threat that we have coming at us in the world of soybeans right now is 2018 could be the year that American farmers, for the first time in history, plant more bean acreage than corn acreage in American soil. Right now, a lot of analysts are expecting just about 90 million corn, 90 million beans nationwide. Not going to take a whole lot to flip that switch and move us into more bean acres. At the end of the day, bean demand has been exceptionally strong. We've seen this. We've seen it from China. We're seeing it domestically as we talk about crush plants being erected, both today, some are expanding today, and then I understand some are on the drawing board for some places in the northern Corn Belt. That would be fantastic. We haven't seen this much excitement over the soybean crush in this country since the mid-1990s. We do have an upswelling of demand being driven in a large part by the expansion of the hog and the poultry flocks in this country. We've got good news here for beans. The bad news is, again, we keep growing big bean crops. If you are planning on growing beans this next year, do be aggressive with your marketing. We're right up here, especially on old crop beans, pushing up against some resistance levels right in there at that, oh shoot, is it 1020? Is that our resistance? Right up in there, 1010. 1020 is our resistance level on the old crop beans. On the new crop, we've got a little bit more premium to it. Let's start to take some risk off the table. We know that South America is going to produce yet another large crop of soybeans. We also know that the Brazilian real has been strengthening against the US dollar, and we're seeing some opportunities develop for American growers. Let's take advantage of them. Don't wait till harvest to get your marketing done. The biggest thing that I think we have to change in our industry, and I would say younger growers are probably going to have to make the biggest adjustment, is we've got to go back to marketing the way you used to market in the 1990s. Take advantage of growing season rallies, get aggressive with those sales. Today we have a fantastic tool in crop insurance. You take 75, 80, 85% coverage. Those are all bushels you can sell in the physical market because you know that you're going to have the money to buy them back should your crop fall short. Unbelievable tool. No other industry in the country has that kind of a backstop to it. We need to utilize it more effectively. I do have a Commitment of Traders report here from the soybean market. It's not nearly as great a guidepost as it is in corn. Those outside investors love the corn market. It's the most heavily traded market. It's the most liquid, so they can get in and they can get out pretty much at any price they want. Soybeans, a little smaller market, and it's a lot more bipolar, I guess, with us and Brazil being the two main competitors. But still, we can see we have some great opportunities to make some sales as those large-scale specs really get into it. But we also see that commercials are a lot more willing to make aggressive sales, which means farmers are selling aggressively. We're pretty good at handling our beans so far today. And finally, I just want to touch on the dollar. Jace talked about this morning how the dollar means nothing, and he's exactly right. When we look at who or what is buying our goods, it's predominantly China. The yuan in China is pegged to the US dollar. They don't care what happens to the dollar. But, again, our markets aren't determined by producers and end users anymore. Our markets are determined by producers, end users, and large-scale speculators, folks that live and breathe on Wall Street, folks that use algorithmic trading and high-speed computers to execute trades for them. One of the things a lot of those trading programs have plugged into them is the value of the dollar, because conventional wisdom is cheaper US dollar, increased US exports. Folks around the world need to eat. They're going to buy beans in China regardless, because if they don't, their people are going to riot, and we will have an Arab Spring in China. And the Chinese government does not want that. They have an abundance of young dudes in China. Young dudes who get hungry do what? They start fires. The Chinese government does not want fires, so they're going to continue to buy our soybeans. But those spec traders do watch the value of the dollar. There's no coincidence that we have had a great rally in the markets while the dollar has come down precipitously since the World Economic Forum in Davos. That's good news. If the dollar continues at its current pace of weakness, even if we do hike interest rates 3 or 4 times this year, as some of the Fed governors are suggesting, we're probably not going to see a massive skyrocketing in the dollar because we also have global economies picking up. For the first time in about 12 years, we have a synchronized global recovery. Most of the developed world is economically recovering right now, and so their currencies are just as attractive or as close to attractive as the US dollar. So that is going to be a tailwind for agriculture, but it won't be much of one. That's my grain update. Who's excited? Woo! Boy, that's a lot of fun. All right, I want to take a break from the grains. Got through the bad news, or at least the relatively bad news, and I want to talk livestock. Livestock is my passion. I grew up in a farm in southern Iowa, awful close to Missouri. And on our farm, we were a pasture-farrow, pasture-finish hog operation. And this was back before you could get a premium for that kind of production practice. This was back when that's what you do when you're poor and raise hogs. You have porta huts in a pasture, and whatever lives, lives. Whatever gets eaten by coyotes got eaten by coyotes, and that was life. One of the things that happened to me as a young person was that Dad never bought a truck. We had a 1982 Mercury station wagon. Wood panel sides, straight out of Chevy Chase's Vacation. That was our farm vehicle. And it had a tailgate in the back window that rolled down, and it was my job to help Dad load the hogs. And we could haul about 4 fat hogs in the back of that station wagon, 27 miles to the Tyson buying facility on Highway 34. And then when we got to the facility, it was my job to get into the back of the station wagon and push these angry hogs out. And they'd flop out of the back of the wagon, hit the ground, and, bounce, and they'd get up. We were not pork quality assurance certified. That scarred me as a child. It left an indelible mark on me as a child, and it scarred me again about 10 years later. Who here has kids in high school? A couple of you. Here's a piece of advice. If you want to guarantee that there is no funny business on prom night, you let your son drive an 82 Mercury station wagon that reeks of hog urine. Guarantee he's going home alone. That was how I grew up. But in spite of that, the love of livestock got into my blood. We raised hogs up until the mid-90s, and then Mom decided that we'd lost enough money raising hogs, and Dad said, yep, I agree. So we started losing money raising cattle, and got pretty good at it. Luckily, that was something I inherited from my dad, the ability to lose money raising cattle. After I graduated from college in 2008, went to work at a bank, about 2 hours away from the home farm, and moved into town. And has anybody here ever moved from the farm into town at some point in your life? Yeah, it sucks, doesn't it? It's terrible. And ladies maybe have a different reason, but for me it was terrible because you can't pee off the side porch when you live in town. Let me clarify that. You can pee off the side porch when you live in town, but neighbors call the cops, and no, I can't go near a school. It's a whole thing. So I was kind of going insane, and my wife and I got married in that time period, and finally, she agreed we could buy a farm. So we moved out to the country and started feeding cattle and raising cows and calves. And my wife, when she had married a banker, she didn't anticipate that doing chores was in her future. And she was not real hip on it for a while. She was a town girl. But in 2014, her mind changed a little bit. In 2014, we had our first bottle calf. And I'm on the road quite a bit in January and February, great times to not have to do chores for cattle. And my wife is home doing the work. She's a great lady. And of course, she gets attached to this little guy. And I'm going to ask you guys a question. Has anybody here ever had a bottle calf at some point? Okay, quite a few of you. Good. All right, is it a best practice, ladies and gentlemen, to name something that you're going to sell or eat? Is that a good idea? No. Not until you understand the life cycle, right? You call him T-Bone, you make your peace with God, and then that's fine. But Heidi grew attached to this little guy, and of course she decided to name him, and she named him Baby Drew. And this is Baby Drew, just a great little calf. You can see he got a little frostbite there in his ears. And Heidi did a great job. Milk, giving him milk every day, 3 times a day, twice a day. Eventually we got him on grain. He was growing strong. 2014, who are my cattle producers in the crowd? Okay, does anybody remember 2014? Did anybody have fun raising cattle in 2014? Should be all of you. We're not going to see those record prices again, I think, in our lifetimes, or at least for a generation. Those were unbelievable prices. So Baby Drew and the other calves are growing strong. The market's going like this. Holy cow, it's going to be a great year. December rolls around. Calves are ready to go. My banker calls, reminds me that I owe him some money. And that was my cue to sell the calves. So I start loading them up in the trailer. I call my wife at work and I say, Heidi, hon, I'm going to sell the calves. Can I sell Baby Drew? And I could hear her voice catch in her throat. And she goes, do we have to? Happy wife, happy life, right, gentlemen? So I said, no, honey, we don't have to sell Baby Drew. I'm sorry I asked, but, you know, he has been steered, so he's not going to make a great herd bull. But steering, you guys snip, you understand what I'm saying? Okay, smell what I'm stepping in? All right. So I said, you know what we can do, though? We can keep him on feed for another year, and then we can eat him. Not what she wanted to hear. She thought for a little while, sobbed briefly, and then thought maybe it was best if we sold him today. So I loaded him up with the rest of the calves, hauled him down to the sale barn, told the ring man when I unloaded him, I said, hey, pull this one aside, sell them separate, make the check out to Heidi Pearson. They did. The calves sold, crazy prices. Had never seen that many zeros on a calf check. Genuine Pearson Cattle Company was almost profitable in 2014. I almost had to pay taxes. Crazy year. And so I picked up my 2 checks at the sale barn office and I drove home. About 8 o'clock at night, I get home, I walk in the front door, Heidi's sitting on the couch, and she takes one look at me and bursts into tears again. She knows I've just sold her little buddy. I've just sold Baby Drew. And she's sobbing on the couch. And gentlemen, that just tears you up inside. That tore out my heart. I want a happy house. I want a happy wife. I want to watch Law and Order. I need her to stop crying. So I did the only thing I could think of, which was reach into my pocket, get the check, right? This should fix it. Honey, I'm sorry I sold Baby Drew, but here's what he brought. I gave her the check. She opened it up. He was so cute with his little eyes and his fuzzy ears. Pulls the check out of the envelope. He followed me everywhere. He begins to read it, and she looks at it, and she goes, huh. She goes, $1,300 from the one calf? I said, yeah. And she goes, well, we should have had 10 of him. And she's been on board with doing chores ever since. It was great for 2014. Unfortunately for my cattle producing friends, it is not 2014. We've seen the market come down a little bit. We saw it come down a lot in 2015. Since then, it's rebounded. It's rebounded. We've found a great little range in here. We've got cash trade happening in the mid-120s. We've got futures right up in there in the mid-120s. We're looking at that 120 to 125 as a range here on the front month contracts. We found some profitability in here. The last quarter saw every sector in the beef industry be profitable. Packers made money, feedlots made money, cow-calf guy made money, ranchers made money. That hasn't happened in about 12 years. We had it happen, well, last quarter and third quarter 2017. Why? What's driving it? We do know that the beef herd was up 1% throughout 2017. We know that there are fewer cattle feeders out in the countryside today. 2015 closed down more than a few of those small-time farmer feeder operations. Where is this demand coming from? Exports are one thing. We're now back into China for the first time since the BSE scare of 2004. We are seeing more beef going to South Korea and Japan. In spite of 50% tariffs in Japan, they're still buying U.S. beef. But the real driver of this demand is domestic. The U.S. consumer is buying beef, and they're paying a premium for it. I didn't realize just how much of a premium they were paying until, well, it was first week of December. I have a podcast, and I've got a co-host, and it's called Ag News Daily. You can Google it and find us in the Play Store and the App Store and whatever. I have a co-host for the podcast, and we have sponsors, and one of them live in Chicago. We want to say thank you, thanks for your business. So we called them and said, hey, we're going to come to Chicago. We want to take you and your team out to dinner. We'll pay for it. You pick the place. Never say that to anybody, first of all. Don't tell them you're going to pick up the tab and then tell them to pick the place. Because our friends picked RPM Steakhouse in downtown Chicago. We went on a Tuesday, December 8th. It was sleeting outside. It was 40-some degrees, 35 degrees at Chicago, so it's windy. There's no kind of holiday celebration or anything going on. We walk into this steakhouse at 5:30 at night. I open up the menu. I have a minor cardiac event after looking at the prices. I call my credit card company, I get my limit raised so I can pay for this dinner. At this restaurant, the cheapest steak on offer was a New York strip. Cheapest steak, $62. This restaurant isn't known for its $62 New York strip. It's known for its 30, 60, and 90-day aged cuts of beef. Those began at $80, and you could get a 22-ounce porterhouse for $312. That's the kind of steakhouse this was. The same kind of steakhouse where you don't get sides with your steak. You've got to buy them all separate. So, of course, we're saying thank you to this company. And it's two guys from there and myself and my co-host. And they're like, oh, we got to get some sides. I'm looking at the menu going, yeah, okay. We can get some sides. We got 3 sticks of asparagus for $27. We got an ice cream scoop of mashed potatoes for $14. We had 1 bottle of wine. We had 1 cocktail. 4 people. 2 hours later, dinner ends. Waiter brings me the check. $570. Plus tip. Yeah. That was mind-blowing to me. But what blew my mind even further was what happened when we got up to leave. The restaurant itself is about 2 of these rooms. Huge, cavernous space downtown Chicago. Tables everywhere. 7:30 on a miserable night. It's dark, it's windy, it's cold, it's sleeting. Nothing's going on. It's a Tuesday, it's a weeknight. 7:30. Every table in that restaurant was full. There were people, enough people in Chicago eating meals that cost on average $125 a person, that they had packed that restaurant on a Tuesday. Folks, when we look at where is this demand coming from, this demand is coming domestically, and in a large part, it's coming from millennial consumers who want to pay not for things, they don't want stuff, according to research, they want experiences. And if there are any millennials here that want experiences, the next time I go to RPM Steakhouse, I'll give you my bill. Because that's an experience. That's an experience. For the first time in American history in 2016, we as a country spent more at restaurants than we did at grocery stores. We are a country that doesn't cook for itself very much anymore. We're a country, particularly the younger generations, that like going out to restaurants. And when you go to a restaurant, you are paying a premium for that cut of meat, and oftentimes that meat is beef. The strength in the cattle market is being driven by equity markets climbing higher and higher until this most recent week, and housing markets that have rebounded incredibly since the depths of the Great Recession. As long as those 2 things continue, anything we can export is just icing on the cake. If we can get more beef to China or South Korea, that's just going to lend us some additional strength in the cattle markets. Quick look at the feeder cattle market. One of the great things that we know about the American cattle feeder, the guy that's running those feedlots up in North Dakota, in western Iowa, and western Kansas, they are hardworking and predictable. If a cattle feeder makes an extra $1 per head, does anybody want to guess what he does with that $1? He buys calves. His hand's up for one more turn at the sale barn. And so what we're seeing as profitability on the feedlot sector is leading right to increased profitability for the cow-calf guy. Now, we're going to see this challenge as the price of corn begins to move. We had corn in that steady $3.50 range. Profitable profitable fat cattle, that's where we got that tremendous rally in this market. Since then, we've pulled back, where the market's trying to get a grasp of how many acres of corn are we going to plant and what is that corn going to price itself out as, because not a lot of guys in the feedlot side were forward contracted for feed demand at $3.50. They've been kind of letting it ride because they knew we had ample supplies. So we could see some weakness here in the feeder cattle as we look out through the summer if corn continues to rally. But the downside risk isn't all that great anymore. We've overcome the worst hump. 1% herd growth in 2017. That's not bad. That's manageable as long as carcass sizes don't get overweight like they did in 2015. Finally, the lean hog market. I know you're not a huge hog-producing state here in North Dakota, but the hog market is one of those that has been a Cinderella story. This is another tale of demand. What we're seeing in the hog market is domestic demand. As folks are going to the grocery store and the restaurant and they're looking at beef prices with a heck of a premium, they're going, well, a pork chop, that'll be okay. And they're buying that pork chop instead. We are also shipping incredible amounts of beef to our overseas customers, particularly to China, which started after that Smithfield purchase. We really cemented that pipeline of high-quality U.S. raised pork going into China, and that's what's been giving us these great price levels. We have the largest hog herd we've had in almost 100 years, actually 60 years. And yet, we're still profitable. We've added 2 new processing plants. We've got another huge one coming online. We added a small one in Windham, Minnesota. The hog industry continues to grow. I work with an elevator that runs a feed mill in northwest Iowa. 2 years ago, they had to expand their feed mill because in their 2-county area, they were adding 50,000 new hog spaces. That's great demand. That's where these new crush plants are finding their buyers. That's part of what's going to drive agriculture as we look out through the rest of the 21st century, right? 22nd century, 21st century, whatever we're in, 2000s. Here's what else is interesting. We talk quite a bit about the expansion of the livestock herd in this country, and it has been prodigious. We've seen everything we grow sell at a record price at some point in the past 15 years, including eggs, including broilers, including pork, including cattle. The blue chart, the blue area on this chart is the developed world. That's the US, that's Canada, it's Western Europe. Even with massive herd increases, it's a drop in the bucket. Because the real herd expansion is happening overseas. It's happening in Southeast Asia, and it's happening in Africa, and it's happening in South America. That's where herds are just exploding. In a large part, they are poultry and pork herds. That's what's growing the fastest first. We're seeing this develop because of what happened in 2014. I want to take us back to that. What we saw happen in 2014 was a really bizarre scenario. Right here, this is one of my favorite charts. It tells us a lot, but it's kind of confusing. We're looking at the spread at the retail level between beef and broiler prices, so at the grocery store at the meat counter, that's the red line, and the spread, the difference in price between beef and pork prices at the meat counter in the blue line. And we're going back to the year 2000. And what you can see is that there's a pretty defined range. As beef gets expensive, consumers changed. They bought poultry or they bought pork. As the price of pork, got too high relative to beef, they switched to beef and vice versa. Meat was interchangeable. It was a protein source. And people made their final decision on what to buy standing in front of the meat case, running through their shopping budget mentally. But in 2014, that changed. In 2014, we see the spread between beef and broilers explode and stay there. We saw the spread between beef and pork explode, and then it narrowed up real quick, not because the price of beef fell, but because grocery stores went, we can make a ton of money on pork, and they raised the price of pork and made incredible margins. So that's what brought that spread back into line. But in both cases, beef was economically inefficient to purchase. If you were looking for protein calories in August of 2014, your best option was to buy poultry. That was the cheapest source of protein calories if that's what you were looking for. But the American consumer didn't do that. They changed the way economists view meat purchases. Consumers were going into the meat case, they were looking and going, broiler chicken breasts are $1.99 a pound, pork loin is $3.99 a pound, and ribeyes are $17.99 a pound. I'll take the ribeye. Economically, it makes no sense. Humans are not rational economic actors. They're not. We're not. I'm not. What people do is they buy based on emotions. And in 2014, we had the entire U.S. middle class coming out of a huge recession. And if we think about this on a macro level, there's a whole lot of pieces that go into it. But if we think about it on an individual level, what happened in 2014 makes a lot of sense. When I graduated from college, it was 2008. So it's the depths of the recession, and I stride out of college with a degree in history. Guess who is not super employable? This guy. So I'm throwing resumes out everywhere. One place offered me a job. It was a bank in Grinnell. Moved to town. Moved 2 hours away, took up my job. I was working as a mortgage lender in 2008. The housing crisis, ladies and gentlemen. I was new to town, fresh out of college, newly married, new to the banking world, and working in a sector of the banking world that nobody wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole, and I worked on commission. Yeah, that's a recipe for poverty, ladies and gentlemen. And for the first several months of my married life, I did not have an income. I'd get up every morning, I'd put on my one sad suit that fit better in 2008. And I'd go into the bank and I'd cold call and I'd go knock on doors and introduce myself. And every day I'd go home with nothing to show for it. My wife and I were living on ramen noodles. We were living on store brand white bread and knockoff Jif peanut butter. We were slow paying all of our bills, crossing our fingers before we flipped the light switch, hoping they hadn't shut off power. Anybody ever been there before? Tough times? 3 of you? Wow. This is God's country up here, isn't it? Man, if you can brave the cold, the good Lord will reward you. For those of you that have never been in that situation, it is miserable. We lived that way for about 5 months. Finally, a doctor moved to town, bought a big house. I wrote the mortgage, got a big commission check. Oh, I had never been so excited. I ran home with that check in my hand. Does anybody want to guess what my wife and I did that night that I got that check? We went out, yes sir, and what did we eat? A steak! Anybody else ever done that? Just you. Just the one guy. The rest of you are vegans. Well, somebody's got to eat all these soybeans. Bless your hearts. We celebrated with the highest quality protein we could afford, which in Grinnell, Iowa is the Grinnell Steakhouse. It's right off 80. If NDSU ever plays University of Iowa again, you won't. They're not going to let that happen. They learned their lesson. But if they do, it's right on your way. The same thing happened in the U.S. economy in 2014. Consumers, middle-class consumers who had been battered about by the worst recession since the Great Depression, finally started to feel a little bit more confidence. Unemployment was dropping, hours worked were increasing, pay rates were steady to climbing very slightly. People wanted to celebrate. They couldn't yet go on that dream vacation, but they could take the cover off that Weber grill that had sat on the patio for 4 years and grill a ribeye. That's what they did. And they paid whatever it cost to get a ribeye in 2014. Now I want us to take that, the model that we learned in 2014, the model of consumer behavior from 2014, and let's explode it. 2014 was a domestic issue. Really tight U.S. beef supplies, smallest herd since 1949, met extremely strong, unexpectedly strong domestic beef demand, and that's what drove prices crazy high. But what we really learned, we got an insight into the mind of the shopper at the meat case, the shopper at the grocery store. And what we found is that they will spend an incredible premium to buy protein when they can afford it and when they have a reason to celebrate. That's the exciting part of agriculture in 2017. 2018, geez, I'm still living in the past. I'm still writing checks and trying to write them off on this year's taxes. No IRS agents are in the crowd, are they? Let's ignore that. We're seeing this happen around the world. These are the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. We're seeing protein consumption increase in all of these countries. And we're looking just at meat. We're not even including dairy or eggs here. What we're seeing is that everybody's got their own little flavor. Chinese prefer pork. The Russians eat very similarly to those of us here in the States. They eat predominantly chicken, followed by pork, followed by beef. Again, they're following that protein ladder: most affordable, second most affordable, least affordable being beef. South Africa, big poultry consumers. Brazil, big poultry, big beef consumers. They raise a lot of cattle down in Brazil. And it's expanded here over the past 5 years. The real growth, the real explosion that we're going to notice in row crop agriculture, though, is happening in Southeast Asia. This is a topic that has been on people's minds for years and years, and it's going to stay on people's minds. The one that jumps out at us is China. We're looking at per capita meat consumption, 2006 through 2016. The Chinese, an economy of 1.2 and change billion people, are eating 42% meat, 42% more meat in 2016 than they did in 2006. To put that into perspective, if the United States were to increase our meat consumption 42%, everyone, man, woman, and child in this country of 300 million and some people would have to eat just about 60 more pounds of meat apiece. I'm willing to give it a shot. But we're going to have a challenge making an infant eat 60 pounds of ribeye. It's going to be one heck of a kid. It's going to be a linebacker. The fact is, it's almost impossible for us to see that rate of growth. China did it over the past 10 years. Now, we have some concerns about the state of the Chinese economy in 2018. Chinese labor costs, which were so cheap, and that's what made them the manufacturing powerhouse they are, since 2000, Chinese labor costs have quadrupled. China is no longer the world's cheapest source of labor. We heard throughout the election season of the Chinese stealing our jobs. That was true in 1994. It is not true in 2018. In fact, in 2018, China's manufacturing jobs are being stolen. Manufacturers are leaving China and they're going to the rest of Southeast Asia, predominantly Vietnam. We're seeing a lot of them move into South Korea. We're seeing some move into Thailand and Indonesia and the Philippines. They're looking for cheaper sources of labor. So that 42% growth we saw happen in China, I believe we're going to see that same thing happen across the other 1.1 billion people in Southeast Asia over the next 15 years. The amount of demand for protein is just getting started. China's not going to slow down. They're not going to stop eating protein. But we're going to add Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan. South Korea continues to grow, as long as they don't get nuked by North Korea. That's going to be bearish, just so we're all in the clear. If nukes actually start to fly, that's bearish for the grains. So absent that, I think we've got a really bright future ahead of us meeting that demand. What's going to happen is we're going to ship a lot of high-end protein to those countries, to the rich folks in those countries. But the real expansion is going to happen in the countryside amongst the lower and middle classes. And now they're able to take the technologies we've developed for raising hogs in barns and broilers in barns. They're able to apply that to a country like Indonesia or the Philippines or Thailand. And they can produce a heck of a lot of pork and poultry. What can't they do, ladies and gentlemen? Grow the beans, grow the corn. Us in Brazil are going to be doing that. So that's where that growth is going to happen for the feed grain industry. We are going to be feeding more animals in this country, yes, but the real expansion is happening over the next 10 to 15 years in Southeast Asia. Then the next wave of growth is going to happen in Africa. That is just getting started right now, and that's going to be something exciting to watch over the next couple years. We do have a challenge. We talked about this. I won't spend much time on it. Abby and her panel did a great job. We've got a challenge with water. West of the Missouri River, broadly speaking, particularly in Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, we do not have enough water. We've built an incredible system of agriculture because they're able to go deep with wells into the Ogallala Aquifer and set up center pivots and 150,000 head feed yards. That's going to be changing. Over the past year, Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, and the New York Times have all run front page stories on the draining of the Ogallala Aquifer. Over the next 50 years, we are going to see it become prohibitive to pump water from the aquifer. Either cost, we're going to run it down far enough that it's just too expensive to sink another well, or through regulation. We're going to change the Great Plains agriculture. A lot of that ground is going to go back to producing dryland wheat, dryland cotton, some edible beans, and the water-intense crops, corn and soybeans, their migration is going to continue north, you guys have seen, and they're going to continue east, up into Canada. That's going to be good news. The other thing that's going to change is livestock production is slowly going to be moving north and moving east, following the water. The challenge we have is too much water. We've got to worry about what happens with the water once it hits our ground and leaves it. What happens to those nutrients? What happens to those inputs? In Iowa in particular, what happens to nitrates? We had a lawsuit about this 2 years ago from the Des Moines Water Works. We're going to see EPA, even under a President Trump, we're going to see state officials, we're going to see EPA looking to keep an eye on what's coming off our farm. Water management, nutrient management practices are going to become essential. And if you do some of these, if you try cover crops, if you put in a terrace or a saturated buffer or whatever, call your local paper. Everybody's hungry for content. That's content we can tie into a national story, and that gets the word out that the farmer is doing the right things. Next, trade. I'll leave this one for questions. We've talked about trade a heck of a lot today. You had two fantastic breakouts on the Farm Bill and trade policy. Trade's vital to ag. We all know that. I'll be happy to take any further questions here in just a second on trade. The final thing I want to talk about is the biggest challenge facing us in agriculture, and that's the disconnect, the separation between the consumer and you, the producer. We know that the average American is 3 generations removed from the farm, but averages aren't always the most telling. Averages can sometimes be misleading. The world is comprised of about 50% men and 50% women. On average, every human has one breast and one testicle. Is that accurate? No. Averages can be confusing and misleading. So we do know that most Americans are not at all connected to where their food comes from. We can't connect with them with agriculture. University of Indiana did a study. They asked their undergraduate students, how much land do you have to own to be considered a large landowner? These students thought about it for a little while. The answer they came up with, you are a land baron if you own a half acre or more. That's hand to God. That's what they said. But think about where these kids grew up, in the suburbs, on quarter and third acre lots. Half acre, that's good, it's big time. You're management if you own a half acre. You probably have a tree. The real deal. How do we connect with those folks? It's tough. We can't do it with agriculture. We have to do it with the next best thing, which is business. America is in an entrepreneurial resurgence right now. Folks respect business for the first time in quite a few years, particularly, believe it or not, the younger generations, millennials and the ones below them. We're watching Shark Tank. They're making crafty crap and selling it on Etsy. They respect businesses. That's where ag comes in. Every person in this room is a business person. Every person in this room has a reason for being here, being in agriculture, and not being a dentist, not being a structural engineer. Those reasons that you have are the reasons we need to tell. And we need to talk about why we got started and what it was like when we got started. Talk about some of the things you learned. When my wife and I got married, you remember the station wagon? Scarred me. When we bought the farm, I told her, I own a farm. I want a 3/4-ton pickup truck. And my wife, who'd grown up in town, hadn't priced a 3/4-ton pickup truck. So she agreed. She said, yeah, that's fine. So we closed on the farm in 2012. I said, we're going into town. I went into town. I went to the Dodge dealership. I wanted a Ram with a Cummins diesel engine. And started looking. I found one. It was a great truck. It was perfect. Beginning farmer vehicle in 2012. It was a quad cab, leather seats, heated, sunroof. All the essentials you need, survival level pickup. It was 50 grand. My wife vetoed it. I said, I get it. I'll keep looking. A couple months later, I'm coming back into town from Des Moines, about an hour drive. I get in town about 8 o'clock at night. It's one of those nights in the Midwest where it's 10 degrees outside, there's no wind, and there's just a gentle snowfall. Storybook beautiful. And I pull into the used car dealership. I make my loop, see what's available, nothing. Getting ready to head back for home. And out of the corner of my eye, in the farthest, darkest corner of that dealer's lot, I saw a red pickup. Spun around, drove up to it. Sure enough, it was a 1990 Chevy 2500. The gas engine. All right. I get out of my car, I go up to it, and I brush that 1/4 inch of snow off the windshield. And right there in the center of the windshield, taped to where the rearview mirror should have been, was a price tag. It was $999. That's in my budget. Went home, talked my wife out of the checkbook, went in the next day to take it for a test drive. Brian, the salesman, hopped in with me. It had just snowed, so as we took it out, we checked the 4-wheel drive. High and low, both work. Air conditioning blew cold on that January morning. This is going to be the nicest truck a Pearson has ever owned. It's a great machine. I'm taking this truck home with me. But I grew up with just enough Missouri farm boy in me. There's one thing I ain't going to do at a dealership. I ain't going to pay sticker. Damn right, we're going to negotiate. So I get back, and Brian says, Mike, what'd you think? And I said, Brian, this is one fine machine. I love this truck, but $1,000. Whoo, brother. Boy, you know what, Brian? I'm going to have to sleep on an investment of this size. Just can't be writing a $1,000 check. And Brian, the salesman, leans in to the cab of that truck, and he put his hands on that beautiful red velour bench seat. Only a few cigarette burns, practically cherry. He looked over at me and he goes, Mike, what would you give me to get this truck off my lot today? Well, I'm in the driver's seat now, Brian. I said, I tell you what, I'll give you $750 cash, tax, title, license, all in for this truck today. Without missing a beat, Brian said, sold, Mike. I'll do the paperwork. I learned a lesson that day. I learned a lesson that maybe some of you in this audience have learned. If a salesperson lets you name your price for something he or she is selling, don't buy that thing. Because it's going to be terrible. Who in this crowd has owned this truck at some point in your life? A couple of you. Who wants to own this truck today? Name your price. Bring a trailer. It ain't making it to North Dakota. This is how my wife and I got started in 2012 with our little feedlot. Every one of you in this room has these experiences where you paid a little tuition to the University of Hard Knocks. That's true in agriculture. That's true in any other industry where somebody has tried to start a business. How do we connect with folks in Silicon Valley? They're entrepreneurs. Connect with this story. They've done the same thing. Maybe not with a truck. Maybe it was a crappy computer. Who knows? But this is how we can relate. This is how we can stay in contact with the rest of America who will be increasingly regulating and legislating our industry. Folks, the future is really, really bright for American agriculture if we can keep it. The next 10 to 15 years, we are going to have to manage our margins. We're going to have to market aggressively, and we're going to have to stay positive. We're going to see folks get out of this business. That's what low prices do. Those folks getting out create opportunities for those of you who have the strength of balance sheet and who have cash on hand. So with that, I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to come up to Fargo, and I want to wish all of you a safe and successful and hopefully profitable 2018. Thank you.
Hey, thank you,
Awesome job, man. We've got time for a couple quick questions here, Mike, if you don't mind. And there's some instructions on your table on how to text questions in. You can submit your questions on the screen on the table. Send the text to 22333. And in the text line, type ND Expo 18. Let me start if we can, Mike.
Please.
Of course, you come from one of those big I states, and market's always paying attention to the I states. We think we do pretty good growing corn and soybeans up here.
Yeah, you need to knock it off, North Dakota.
So tell me, what kind of impact does these flex acres we have here in North Dakota, northwest Minnesota have on this market?
You know, it's fascinating to see, and I think, honestly, you guys increasing your corn and soybean acres have made every analyst's job so much more difficult. Because you can grow spring wheat, you can grow corn, you can grow beans, you have the ability to be flexible. We don't. In my neighborhood, the typical crop rotation for myself and my neighbors is corn, snow, corn, snow, corn, snow. That's what we do. When things get bad, occasionally we'll plant beans. But the flexibility of the acreage that you guys have in this part of the world, and as it continues to increase up into Canada, it makes forecasting acreage really difficult. Analysts right now are looking 90-90, as I mentioned earlier. That's because that's an easy one to just kind of say. We're not going to have any handle on really what's planted until March from the planning perspectives, planning intentions. Yes, thank you. I need more coffee. I'm getting a little low on energy. Planning intentions report. Up until then, I mean, it's a crapshoot.
If NAFTA tanks, a question from the crowd, what's going to happen to these grain and livestock markets?
Great question. So if NAFTA tanks, if President Trump does issue a tweet at 2 o'clock in the morning while he's on the toilet or wherever he is when he does these things, that's when I tweet. For those of you that follow me on Twitter, now you know. Put that image in your head. If he tweets out, we're leaving NAFTA, there is an incredible amount of headline risk in these markets. Could we see limit down days in corn and beans for several days? Probably. Will we see any actual interruption to grain flow, physical grain? Probably not. Mexico is probably going to make a big show of a small order from Brazil or Argentina, basically as a middle finger to President Trump. But at the end of the day, we've got the rail lines going into Mexico. We've got the integrated supply chains with pork producers up into Canada. The physical grain, the physical movement of commodities isn't going to change much, but the large-scale speculators, those headline traders, have a pile of money and they will aggressively short this market on anything that is perceived as negative to trade. So it'll be a 2-week or 3-week blip before we kind of get our senses back. It'll be a great time for re-ownership if you've made some cash grain sales.
Mike, you talked about the increasing demand, increasing population. Do you see markets still being in that 30-year cycle that you talked about if that trend accelerates?
That's the wild card. Could this trend accelerate? We're seeing acceleration with everything. So over the past 120 years, it's been 30 years to build this up to a demand cycle. As we look out over the next 30 years to 25 years, Could we see it happen sooner? Yes, I think we certainly could. We now have the technology to expand livestock herds faster than we have ever had before in history. We do have the capacity to add other non-feed sources of demand, be it ethanol in China, if they truly go to an E10 blend across the country. Whether India begins to be a player in the ethanol markets to clean up their poor air quality, all of those things could accelerate that 30-year cycle and make it a 15-year cycle. Who knows?